Today we're going to be talking about basic knife skills and safety. Today we will cover the different parts of a knife and how to identify them, the different types of knives that we use in our kitchens, as well as selecting the right knife for the job, how to hold a knife properly, learning the different functions of the guiding hand, as well as knife safety. Let's start off by talking about the anatomy of a knife. Let's start at the back here. This entire portion right here is considered the handle, but the very back here is called the butt. Then, of course, over here, this entire part is considered the blade, but getting more specific, that top edge is called the spine. Then, of course, there's the tip of the knife. The sharp edge of the knife is called the cutting edge. And then that back of the cutting edge that's closest to the handle is called the heel of the blade. Next, we're going to talk about knife types and selecting the right knife for the job. Now, there are a ton of different types of knives, but just for the sake of time and efficiency, we're going to focus on the 3 knives that you're going to most likely see in your kitchens. First up is the chef's knife. Its blade can be anywhere from 8 to 14 inches, and it's your all-purpose knife. If you're only going to have one knife in your kitchen, this is the one that you want to have. The reason it's perfect if you're just going to have one knife is because it covers everything from large things like watermelon, kind of in the middle things like maybe dicing an onion, all the way down to the really small things like fine mincing herbs. It does everything big to small. Another knife you might see in your kitchen is a serrated knife, and it's a knife that the cutting edge of it down here at the bottom has a scalloped tooth-like edge. That scalloped cutting edge makes it perfect for cutting foods that have a tougher exterior but a softer interior. So a really good example would be bread. Bread knives are always serrated. You pretty much always want to use a serrated knife to cut bread because that keeps you from smushing it all together. Another food that you might use it for is maybe for tomatoes, because kind of like bread, that outer skin is pretty tough, but the inside is kind of squishy. Now, you can maybe cut a tomato with a chef's knife, but you would really need to make sure that that knife is really sharp in order for it to go through. The last knife we're going to talk about is a paring knife. They're used for small jobs, and the blade is usually anywhere from 2 to 4 inches. The one that I have pictured here is just a regular type blade, but they do also sometimes come in serrated blades as well. Some of the small jobs that you might use a paring knife for are hulling strawberries, which would be taking off this green part up here, coring a tomato, and then at home, because we're definitely not doing it in the schools, but say at home when you're deveining shrimp here in the back. Those are some things that you might use a paring knife for. Now we're going to transition into talking about how you hold a knife. First and foremost, you may not even know how you hold a knife until you actually do it. It's not something you really think about too much. But a really common way that a lot of people who don't work with knives too often or haven't put a whole lot of thought into it is the handle grip. It's basically just creating a fist around the handle of the knife. It's fairly common, but really it's not ideal. So why is the handle grip not the ideal way to hold a knife? Well, the reason for that is because the majority of the weight is all on one side of the knife. So when you hold it like this, if you think about it, the weight of your palm and that whole other side of your hand is all over here. The only thing on this side is just a couple tips of your finger. It makes for a very unbalanced hold on the knife, and the weight is not evenly distributed. The preferred grip for professionals is called the pinch grip. Now, how that works is that your index finger is slightly bent and hooks lightly on the outside of the knife where the blade meets the handle. And then you can see that there's still plenty of space between the tip of your finger and the bottom of the blade, so it's safely out of the way of that cutting edge. And then on the other side of the knife, your thumb rests on the inside of the blade, again, safely above the cutting edge. And actually, you can move that thumb up forward even more so than is shown in this picture. It's called the pinch grip because when you look at it kind of head on, it looks like you're pinching the blade of the knife between your thumb and your index finger. So what's so great about the pinch grip? Why is it the preferred grip of professionals? Well, let's start with this. Your palm moves more towards the center of that handle, as opposed to just all of that weight being on one side like it was in the handle grip. It makes the weight more balanced. And then also with that pinch grip of moving those fingers forward onto the blade, you're moving your hand further up and away from the butt of the handle. And by moving it up, you're actually giving yourself more control of the knife. And then having a finger on each side of that blade gives you a counterbalance of weight as well. So overall, it just becomes a much more comfortable grip that offers you more control of the knife. One time while I was teaching this type of thing in person, I was just going over with everyone how much more comfortable and more of a natural fluid motion that the pinch grip offers versus the handle grip. With the handle grip, I feel like you get really, really tense and locked up in your shoulders. Whereas moving your hand down a little bit further on that blade, it makes everything feel a lot more smooth, natural, and you're not quite so locked up in the shoulders. So here I'm going to play you guys a video where Maddie is switching back and forth between the handle grip and then moving down into the pinch grip and then back. Every time she goes back to the handle grip, her shoulder is a lot higher and more locked up and kind of pushed back. Then when she moves into the pinch grip, her shoulder goes down and you can just see how much more comfortable it is. So let's see if you can catch this. Locked up is the handle grip, shoulder down, more natural with the pinch. And then back to handle, and then to pinch. You can just see how much more her shoulders aren't going to hurt her as much at the end of the day. So I completely understand that right off the bat, that pinch grip may not feel super natural to you. So the key is just for a while, every time you pick up a knife, make yourself do it, and eventually it'll become more natural. If in the beginning it's really a struggle for you, there is one kind of in-between grip that you can use as training wheels, but it's not ideal. It just makes sure that you're using it as a step to get to the pinch grip, just as a transitional tool. So this would be called the point grip, and it's where the index finger rests on the spine of the blade. So it's a little bit better than the handle grip because the weight of the hand moves more to the center of the handle, but you still don't have the full stability and control that you would with the pinch grip. All right, we're finally done talking about how to hold a knife. So now we're going to talk about the guiding hand. The guiding hand is the other hand that's not holding the knife. It guides either the food or the knife. For now, we're just going to focus on two functions that the guiding hand can do. The first one is the claw. I was really super excited about this because it fits in perfectly. I don't know if you remember this part in Toy Story with the aliens, but that's the claw game. And it was even better because the colors of the aliens match my presentation. Could not be more perfect. This is what the claw guiding hand looks like. It's when your fingers are safely curled inward and then your thumb is tucked behind the fingers. This flat portion of your finger, kind of like the knuckle, is what acts as a guide for the knife, and then you never lift your knife any higher than your knuckles. The flat portion of your finger or your knuckle acts as a safety barrier between the blade of your knife and your fingers. And there are two different methods to using this as your barrier. The first method is where you keep your little claw hand flat up against the blade the entire time, and then you move across the food. I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, I'm gonna play you a video here that shows you. So she's keeping her knuckles flat up against that blade, and let's just pretend that she's moving across her food right here the whole time. The second method is where you can hold the food back here with your claw hand, and then you can cut across the food until that blade comes all the way across and then hits that barrier. That's when you would know to stop. Okay, now I'm going to show you a video of how that would work. Let's just pretend, say she's holding like a big stalk of celery here. She's holding it back here, she's cutting across the celery, and then as soon as that knife blade hits that flat portion of her fingers, she stops. Now let's... You get the idea. It's a little funky just because we're not using any actual food, but you get the idea, I think. Another function of the guiding hand is when it's the stabilizer. That's when the tip of the knife is kept on the board and your hand is placed on the spine of the knife, keeping it stable as you rock the blade up and down. This would be commonly used when you're mincing herbs or like fine dicing something. I added in a second slide here real quick. In the first one, it was just this picture right here where you're using your palm of your hand on it, but I also wanted to show you that another way that you can do is using 2 to 3 fingers. Either are okay as long as you're keeping those fingers pointed up and out of the way of the cutting edge of your knife. Whichever makes you feel more comfortable will work just fine. Now I'm just going to show a quick video on both. The first one using just a couple of your fingers. And then for the second one is using your whole palm of your hand. You can't talk about knives without talking about knife safety. Just wanted to point out, a general rule of thumb for anything pertaining to knife safety is to keep the tip of the knife facing down. You're going to see that as a common theme throughout most of the things we'll talk about going forward. Let's start with a little trivia. What do you think is more dangerous, a sharp knife or a dull knife? Give you a minute to think about it, or a couple seconds. The answer is a dull knife. I'm not even going to say the joke here, I'm going to make you read it. But I enjoyed it more than I should. So you might be thinking, how could a dull knife possibly be more dangerous than a sharp knife? How does that make any sense? Well, we're not saying that sharp knives aren't dangerous, because they definitely still are, but dull knives actually tend to be pose more of a risk. And the reason for that is because you end up using so much extra force to try to make it cut. And that excess force makes it much more likely that the food or knife is going to slip, and then that's how cuts happen. So here, an example that I like to give is, think of a time that you were trying to cut a tomato and your knife was dull. I kind of touched on earlier that you could use a chef's knife for a tomato, but you want to make sure it's nice and sharp because of that tough exterior skin. So if you're really trying to get into that tomato and that skin is just not cooperating, that your knife's not cooperating through that skin, that's just when it becomes more likely for things to slip and slide and it becomes dangerous. The other thing is that sharp knives give a clean cut. Now, it might still hurt a little bit and it may bleed, it probably will, but clean cuts from a sharp knife end up being a lot less painful, whereas a dull knife becomes more like a puncture or like a stab, and that can be way painful. So it's really important for safety reasons that we keep our knives nice and sharp. Next part of safety is to make sure that you're always cutting on an appropriate and stable work surface. We don't ever want to cut directly on our stainless steel tables for several reasons. First of all, it will dull your knife blade very, very quickly. It will also scratch the table. And then lastly, this is very slippy and slidey, and then it becomes dangerous because it's not stable at all. In our kitchens, that means you're always cutting on a cutting board, because that's all we have. An interesting thing to point out about cutting boards is that they're made of a porous material. So whether it's kind of like the acrylic ones that we have in our kitchens or even like a wood one at home, that porous texture actually grips onto the blade of the knife a little bit as you're cutting. Now, it doesn't grip onto it so much that you can't keep cutting and it's like holding onto the knife, but it kind of holds that blade a little bit as you cut through, just enough to give a little bit of traction, and it keeps your knife from slipping and sliding all over the place. In the majority of the day-to-day chopping and things that you're going to be doing, you're going to be keeping your knife on your board. Just chopping, doing that mincing where you're keeping that tip down. But every once in a while, there may be something that requires you to move the blade completely off of your board. An example of that is cutting a large watermelon. In this instance, in order to stay safe, you want to hold the handle like you normally would, and then you want to use 2 to 3 fingers or so, a few inches in from the tip of your knife, and actually hold that blade. This is a time where we don't want you to put the palm of your hand on the spine, because imagine you have that big watermelon here. It can get dangerous because you need additional force. So sometimes as you're going down with that extra force, the palm of your hand can slip off more easily. You can kind of stab the side of your hand. Whereas over here on your right, when you are firmly gripping the spine and using that additional force to cut through that watermelon or other large item, it becomes a lot safer. Let me see if I can play these videos. First one, it's a little dramatic acting of how it can be dangerous. Yes, it's overly dramatic. We get it. But we're just trying to make a point. And then over here on the right is the correct way. By gripping it with your fingers, you have more control while you're using that excess force, and it's safer. When walking with a knife, you want to make sure, kind of like what we talked about earlier, that the tip is kept down and that the blade is facing behind you and you're holding the knife close at your side. And then as you're walking, say knife behind you, just so that the people around you know, so they're not turning around and, like walking into it. But firmly at your side, tip down, blade facing behind. Another important aspect of knife safety is to never try to catch a falling knife. Some of you are probably rolling your eyes at me right now because it sounds super obvious, but sometimes our instinct kicks in. And unfortunately, instinct and logic are two very different things. My poor friend Scott gets used as an example of this every single time I talk about it. Poor guy. Anyways, a long time ago, Scott and I were working side by side. And he was just over chopping away, and then I was over next to him doing the same, minding my own business. And in case you couldn't figure it out, I am the one without the beard. So anyways, chopping away, minding our business. Then apparently something crazy happened. I couldn't even tell you what because I was too busy looking down paying attention to my own stuff. So Scott was chopping, something crazy happened, and his knife went flying up into the air and then over towards me. And unsuspecting me was just standing there chopping away, not realizing what was coming at me. His instinct kicked in and it was, oh my gosh, this is my fault. This knife is going her way. I don't want her to get cut because of something that I did. So that instinct of his that kicked in was to reach out and try to catch the knife to try to keep it from landing on me. And it didn't go so well because he ended up cutting the palm of his hand as well as part of his forearm. So, perfect example of how it does happen. You think it's never ever going to happen, but sometimes that instinct in weird ways just pops in. So you just got to fight it. Fight the instinct. So what you want to do is, if there's space for you to take a step back and just let the knife fall completely. After it is done its thing, it's totally stable now and fallen to the floor or wherever it is, then you wait and you pick it up. The final part of knife safety is to never leave knives in the sink. You don't want it to be in the water where people can't see that it's there. They go reaching around and then they end up cutting themselves on the sharp blade. So best practice would be, if you have time right then and there to take your knife through all 3 parts of the washing sink and put it out to dry yourself, go ahead and do it. But understandably so, there are times when you don't have time to wash your knife right then and there. You got to run out and start serving on the serving line. So the next best thing to do is to have like a sanitizer bucket or some sort of pan filled with soapy water at the beginning of your 3-compartment sink, and you're going to put the knife into it tip down. This way, later on, you or somebody else can safely retrieve it by the handle to wash it themselves. And there's no risk of them getting cut because they're not reaching around and accidentally cutting themselves because they don't see it. Thanks for joining me today to talk about all things knives. You can use this video to count towards your training under Operations Code 2130.